Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Tortoise ThinkIn, where we're trying to do something which I imagine newsrooms all around the world are trying to do. We're trying to do it in the way that we approach, I suppose, all of our journalism, which is to start with an open conversation, to start with a think-in, bring people who've got a depth of expertise together, but try and hear from everyone in the room who's got something to contribute. Because one of the most curious things, it seems to me, about the COVID pandemic of 2020 and into 2021 is that the biggest, and in some senses the only story in the world, is still shrouded in such mystery about how it began. And there is still so little agreement. In fact, there's such strong agreement about the causes that are incorrect. There seems to be a ferocity around that, but little understanding of how it began and what were the forces behind it. And in the course of this evening, what we want to do is to turn to Nicholas Wade, turn to Dennis Carroll, but turn to all of you joining us and hear what you've heard, what you've seen, what are the lines of inquiry that you think we should follow. I come at this, as you well know, without the scientific expertise you probably need. So I'm going to be the, I hope, useful idiot in this process, in at least saying, sorry, can you hold up there, Nicholas? Can you just go a little slowly, Dennis? Because there's a good deal of this we don't understand. I'll give you a little pre-reading, which I promise you will be an enlightenment tonight once we're done, which is Nicholas Wade wrote a really thorough and thoughtful piece, which has sort of been, I suppose, one of the reasons why you've become a go-to person on this subject, Nicholas, for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which was published last month, which, if you like, weighs the arguments around the natural leak theory versus the lab leak theory. And I wonder, Nicholas, if we could start there, it would be a useful thing, just to, if you like, talk us through from the debunking of the Wuhan wet market to the two theories that now compete for explaining the origins of COVID-19.
Well, the two theories are natural emergence and lab leak. So natural emergence was very plausible from the beginning because we've had so many previous epidemics that come from wild animals to humans. And in particular, we've had one of these bat virus epidemics, the SARS-1 epidemic of 2002. So it seemed very natural to suppose that the COVID-19 virus, which we very soon found out was a bat virus closely related to SARS-1, that this had emerged in the same way. And the reports of the people falling ill at the wet market also mirrored the genesis of SARS-1, where it turned out that animals called civets, which are eaten, sold for meat at Chinese wet markets, were the intermediary hosts between bats and people. So all that seems to be sort of falling into a pattern that told you that COVID-19 had come from bats via some intermediate host yet to be discovered. On the other hand, there was a rival hypothesis there right from the start, and a very obvious one too, also very plausible, and that is that in Wuhan is the leading Chinese center for the study of bat coronaviruses, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So we know that lab leaks are not rare. They do happen with some quite surprising frequency. So it was an obvious possibility that a virus being studied at the Wuhan Institute of Virology had leaked out and caused the epidemic, which indeed started in Wuhan. So right from the start, we've had those two hypotheses, both of them plausible, on the table, and there is still no direct evidence for either hypothesis.
And can I have a go at, if you like, the debunking of each, Nicholas, before I come to Dennis in a moment? The debunking, if I understand it correctly, and you'll explain it, of the natural emergence hypothesis was, if you like, that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was too neat. It latched on too cleanly to humans. Was this the reason why people were skeptical about it from the start?
No, I don't think that emerged till somewhat later, in part because Nature kept rejecting the paper that made that very interesting claim. I think what happened is that with natural emergence, we kept on expecting to find the voluminous traces that a virus leaves in the environment as it becomes a human pathogen. And certainly in the case of SARS-1, we found the intermediate host, the civets, I think within 3 or 4 months of the outbreak, and it took longer to find the bats. But even before then, we'd seen the numerous mutational changes in the virus as it very sort of slowly adapted itself from attacking bats to attacking civets to attacking humans just a little to attacking humans just a lot. It's about 25 separate mutations you could see in the virus. So when you look to see all the same things with SARS-CoV-2, it was very surprising you couldn't find a thing. And as the months have passed, each month it has become more and more of a strain on that hypothesis to explain why we can't find any of these telltale traces in nature.
And can I ask you, just we'll get into sort of, if you like, the analysis of the lab leak in a moment, Nicholas. But were you in March, April, May skeptical of the natural emergence theory?
Of this year?
No, of last year, in March 2020.
I don't remember there being much skepticism of natural emergence at that time. In fact, it was riding high throughout most of last year. And people who suggested there might have been a leak from the lab were being subjected to accusations that they were peddling conspiracy theories by the adherents of natural emergence.
Well, in that spirit, let me go to Dennis, because Dennis, you've obviously been, I mean, as I said, this is a fiercely contested subject. You were in the center, if you like, of the circus of that, a year or so ago, in that publication of the letter of the Lancet, which said, look, the people who are pointing the finger at the Wuhan Institute of Virology are doing so with no evidence of fact, and there's no reason to believe that this is a lab leak. It seemed as though your argument was entirely pinned on natural emergence. Have you changed your view of that?
Well, first off, the letter to Lancet a year ago didn't speak to lab leak. It spoke to what was then a very lively political discussion about whether this was a laboratory bioengineered virus. And so in that letter to Lancet, I and others took issue that there was no evidence that suggested that it was not a natural virus. The evidence that was available was very consistent with it being a natural virus. So it was really silent on the question about whether or not there was a lab leak or not. And that was not a point of discussion a year ago.
And so, but well, tell me how your thinking has progressed, Dennis. Rather, so I slightly led the witness there. Tell me how your thinking has progressed from, if you like, the start of 2020 to where we are now.
Okay. Well, first off, I would say the evidence continues to be very strong that this is a natural virus. But I think, as Nicholas has pointed out, we don't have evidence, and this is what science is all about, evidence. We don't have evidence that really says natural or laboratory leak. We have probabilities. The probability based on the frequency of spillover versus lab leaks, the fact that Wuhan is in what you would characterize as a hotspot for coronavirus risk naturally, as well as having the Wuhan laboratory. All of these lead people to have opinions based on probabilities, but we don't have the evidence. And that's really the missing link here, that a year and a half into this pandemic, it's really putting us all at a disadvantage, that we've not had the advantage of being able to do the kind of vigorous investigative work that, quite frankly, as Nicholas referred to with the SARS-CoV-1, had been done shortly after that outbreak. So we need to be able to get in, look at those markets, look at the value chains that transported potentially sort of infected wildlife animals into the markets, but we also need to get into the laboratories to be able to do the kind of forensic investigation that would give us the answer one way or the other. And so right now we're caught in a position of opinions. We're caught in the position of what's most likely, but we're not in a position to say, based on evidence, what in fact was the origins of this pandemic. So my belief at this point is that we're being disserved by having strongly opinionated arguments in the absence of evidence.
And Dennis, I see Ian Birrell's got points of view on this. I'm going to come in a moment if I can to you, Ian. But Dennis, can I give you, if you like, the non-scientific layman's kind of account of the narrative here, and see what you make of it, which is that COVID breaks out. The initial theory is the wet market. That has some traction for not long, a few weeks, possibly a couple of months. And then the theory moves that it's still natural emergence, it's still transferred from bats, but there were people exploring, possibly even for scientific purposes, the caves of Yunnan. And in the caves of Yunnan, bat droppings somehow infect the people who've been exploring there, and they bring it back into the human population. At that time, there are some people who challenge it and say, look, it's just too much of a coincidence that the Wuhan Institute for Virology is in Wuhan, where this outbreak begins. That's seized upon by then President Trump, and that's used as an example of, if you like, US sinophobia, and the scientific community rallies around to say, look, you cannot start pointing the finger at scientific discovery. And if you like, the journalistic world falls in line behind that position, and that theory is quietly sort of not entirely silenced, but marginalized. And then in the months and months since then, more and more people start saying, actually, natural emergence is not necessarily the overwhelming likelihood. It's as strong a possibility, possibly even a more likely probability, that it's come from the lab. And when the WHO report comes out in February, a whole bunch of people say, this is just not good enough. The dismissal of the lab leak theory is not good enough. And now you find the scientific world actually quite anxious that what's going to happen is, rather than pointing this to a kind of freak of nature, it's going to be a failure of science. And the scientific world is sort of defensive again for different reasons. That's the outsider's view of it.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that, Dennis?
Well, first off, I think scientists have to be careful about being defensive, period. And what we need to be doing is gathering the evidence so we can speak thoughtfully about what did in fact happen. That said, there's nothing in the last year and a half that really has changed the likelihood that this is a natural event. That is, no new evidence has come up to weigh more heavily in favor of the lab versus the natural. That said, these are two possible avenues. And as I've said before, it's the purpose of science is to be able to shine a light on evidence, and the evidence, we need to get that evidence. So the WHO report was a disappointment. It was not evidence rich. It dealt in secondary analyses based on evidence that they didn't have direct access to. But let's also be clear that the WHO investigation was the first step in what needs to be a multi-step investigative process. WHO's did not provide the kind of starting insight we would have liked to have seen. And we need to follow that up with a much more robust international investigation with Chinese scientists that really allows us to sort out, opinion from fiction from fact.
Dennis, thank you. But before I said I'd come to Ian Birrell, which I'm going to do, and I'd like to come to Karen Key in a moment too. But Nicholas Wade, can I asked you if you'd like to explain to us what are the flaws in the natural emergence theory, right? What are the flaws in the lab leak theory?
Well, I don't know that there are flaws in them. And by the way, I see the history of this issue somewhat differently from what you imply. I think, first of all, it was or should have been obvious from the start that lab leak was a very strong possibility. And it was also should have been obvious from the start that the virus could have been manipulated. And we now know that when the signers of the Nature Medicine letter in March 2020 that was so influential in persuading everyone that the virus could not have been manipulated, we now know from emails obtained under the Freedom of Information Act from Dr. Fauci's office that that team of virologists, when they first looked at the virus, decided unanimously that the virus did not fit into any evolutionary tree. In other words, that it had been manipulated. That was their first thought. And that should have been the first thought of every virologist who knows his business in the world. And yet they all were silent. None of them objected when the Nature Medicine letter came out and said this virus could not have been manipulated. Every virologist knows there are ways to manipulate viruses that do not leave any trace. And they were silent, and the scientific community was silent.
Why, Nicholas? Why do you think?
Well, I'm not, I have a theory, but I don't know if it's true. All I know is that people who should have spoken up did not do so. And that meant that the press, with the mainstream media that essentially sort of depends on scientists in this kind of issue, they also were silent because their sources were silent. And so people continued to believe that natural emergence was the only theory on the table right up until about March or April of this year.
But can I just be clear? Because in your, I mean, you're very careful in your piece in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists to say, look, the mistake that was made in March 2020 was to, in effect, although I appreciate your point, Dennis, although it wasn't specifically dismissing the lab leak theory, it was dismissing the man-made theory, and it was asserting the theory of natural emergence, and that was premature. The scientists were actually not being scientific because they didn't have enough evidence to make that assertion. And so you in your piece don't come down on one side or the other, because in the end, I suppose your point is, I don't have the evidence to make a, make a sufficiently grounded judgment. But has your view moved in the course of the year that from natural emergence being a possibility to being increasingly unlikely, and lab leak from unlikely to more probable?
That's a question to me.
That's a question to Nicholas, actually.
To Nicholas, okay.
Oh, well, I think what I said in my piece was, although we don't have direct evidence for either theory, nonetheless, if we then ask which theory explains better a number of salient pieces of evidence, with all of them, the lab leak gives you a much easier, less forced explanation. So therefore, on present evidence, that seems the more likely theory. That's my position.
All right. Nicholas, thank you. I'm going to just bring in Ian Birrell. I said I would. Ian, why don't you weigh in just on this question?
On the whole question, I mean,
yeah,
I think
on the
Dennis
whole question, because you said a fair few things in the chat, and I think that Dennis and Nicholas, who've been talking, won't have necessarily read the points you made.
Well, I think Dennis is being disingenuous already. Let's face the facts. That Lancet article was a covert attempt by Peter Daszak, which he organized 6 days after the meetings between Fauci and Farah. He organized this letter covertly, got people to sign it, and deliberately hid the fact that he was the author of it. It was part of a deliberate attempt, which was further pushed by Daszak over the following months, in which he talked about the idea of any attempt to look at a lab leak was baloney, a conspiracy theory, etc., etc. And he also has a very vested interest in the laboratory at the center of a lot of the questions. That's done untold damage, I think, to science by colluding, by people who've colluded in this attempt to shut down debate. Dennis then says that there was no discussion of lab leak a year ago. If I can carry on, Dennis says there was no discussion.
Just hold 1 second. Just 1 second. I'm going to ask you to continue in a second. I just want to make one point, which is obviously Peter Daszak is not here. And you know the way these letters are formed, often they are, it's not just covert, it's just that you try and get a group of people.
No, he said.
So it has as much impact as possible.
We've seen the emails. He said we need to hide where it was.
Oh, really?
But we've seen the emails where he said he wants to hide who the author of it, where it's coming from. That's clearly stated in the emails. So it's not a normal thing. Also, Dennis said that a year ago there wasn't any discussion of lab leak. That's incorrect. I wrote my first article on it in June. In May, I was talking to scientists in America and Australia who were very carefully, very cautiously just saying, this looks a very weird virus. There are things in it that are inexplicable. It's not mutating as we'd expect. It has properties that aren't found on other similar types coronaviruses. And they were raising the idea that there could possibly have been a lab leak and that the lab leak should be investigated. That's all people were saying, not that it came from a lab leak, that purely that there should be the hypothesis merits investigation based on the evidence. And now a year later, people are finally coming around to that after this attempt to shut down debate by the scientific establishment. And now what do we know? We know that there is no evidence backing the idea that it was a natural zoonotic transmission, despite 80,000 samples being tested. Obviously, history shows that's the most likely course and the traditional course of such things. And there's a very strong possibility that is how it emerged. Equally, there's no clear, hard evidence that it was a laboratory leak. What there is, however, is a considerable amount of circumstantial evidence which raises suspicions based around the activities of some of the laboratories in question, not just Wuhan Institute of Virology, but others, based around the activities of the scientists, based around the activities of the laboratory itself. We know that it had known safety concerns, which were admitted to even in academic journals by the head of safety and the Communist Party chief in the laboratory. We know also that they took all their things offline in September last year when no one knew there was a pandemic, claiming that there was hacking, which is just totally implausible to take down the library. And of course, there is the weirdness that of all the places in the world, this virus happened to begin in this city, hundreds of miles from the homes of the bats, and yet with the world's biggest repository of bat coronaviruses. So there are so many suspicions pointing to it. And I think the actions of the scientific establishment, and I'm afraid that includes people like Dennis, in shutting down this debate deliberately and essentially smearing people who were just trying to raise the idea that we should have an open and free discussion. And I'm afraid my own profession of journalism hasn't emerged well either, because they've gone along with this instead of challenging the scientific view on this. The simple fact is that we have no idea one way or the other, and both ideas are plausible and should be investigated. And it's a real shame it's taken until now for that to be an acceptable thing to say.
Dennis, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, absolutely. First off, let me just say, Ian put a number of points out there. First and foremost, there was nothing covert or conspiratorial about this letter. Unlike Ian, I was part of the drafting of this letter. It was not done in any kind of covert or clandestine way. Secondly, the context of the letter was really responding to what were the political polemics around the COVID-19 pandemic at that moment. And at that moment, the President of the United States had in effect weaponized the whole discussion around COVID-19, moved it from being a public health scientific issue to being a blatant political issue. The letter to Science, or to Lancet, was an explicit response to those political points that needed to be addressed. The issue about laboratory leak was not part of that discourse at that moment. It was several weeks later when the US government began pivoting their argument from an engineered virus to a lab leaked virus. So the timeline, sorry, Ian, it doesn't work the way that you're talking about it. And I really take issue with this conspiratorial notion in the drafting of a letter and some kind of nefarious agenda that Peter Daszak may have had. The scientists who signed onto that letter signed onto it because they were committed to the notion that we needed to be driven by evidence and that we were best served if we could move forward in being thoughtful and evidence-based when we talk about this virus. That said, that does not take off or put on the issues around a laboratory leak. That is a serious issue that needs to and needed to be considered. I do not and have never dismissed the idea that this is a laboratory leak. I have, however, said there is no evidence one way or the other. There are probabilities. What is the greatest likelihood of how this virus emerged the weight of that falls on the side of natural emergence, but probabilities are probabilities. If a lab leak is involved, then what we need is to move away from the polemics and get a well-balanced scientific investigation to be able to make a determination one way or the other. Otherwise, as you said, circumstantial evidence is not the same thing as having facts. It's circumstantial. And circumstantial can be compelling in a criminal case. This is not a criminal case. This is about trying to understand the origins of a deadly virus so that we can be better prepared for the next one. It's fundamentally a public health and scientific issue that needs to be resolved by scientific investigative efforts, period.
Dennis, I'm going to invite Ian just to come back in a moment, but I wanted just to pick up on Karen Key's point, because Karen was describing the intersection of the politics. Karen, there you are. You were talking about sort of the politics in the moment at the time.
Right. So I just want to really agree with Dennis that what he's doing is setting this in the context of the time when this story first emerged. And I 100% agree that we want to get the answer as to the origin. But when this was happening and these wild theories were coming from the president, who was a known liar and also racist, and journalists were trying to figure out how to deal with him. And they were really back on their heels on how to deal with someone who lies every single day. If we think about the timing, it is a news story, what is the origin? But when you're in the early days of a pandemic, we were trying to deal with the pandemic and how to give people the information they needed to not get sick and die. And so, of course, this is an important question, but now we have journalists in the United States engaged in a blame game over what happened a year ago. What I'd like to see is an actual investigation to get to the root of it, of course. But yeah, this dynamic of, it's not about what happened. It's about this kind of both sidesism, and journalists should be ashamed of themselves for not having investigated it when we were, again, the context, in the middle of a pandemic. And these words coming from the president, who was completely unreliable. And even if he happened to, by accident, have said something that was valid, it was an accident because he had no evidence. So I just feel like we've got two different things going on. One is needing the investigation, and the other is this sort of retelling the story in a way that is just not accurate and becomes more of a blame game than it is about evidence.
But Karen, I think that's really interesting. I think the thing that's difficult, of course, in this is that there's been such swings, haven't there, in our relationship with science and scientists in the course of the last year, and this is obviously part of it too. There's been kind of frustration with science, science's savior moment, suspicion of science, and I think we're seeing a similar thing here. Ian, forgive me, hold one more second, because I just wanted to go to Nicholas on one issue, which is that John Hawksley asked a question which is really clear, and Judith Patton asked a question, and I think we just need to get them both straight. One was, can we make a distinction between lab leak and lab engineered? Dennis was just saying you may believe in the lab leak, but not necessarily in the manipulation of the virus. Is that a meaningful distinction? And Judith Patton asked the question, what are these viruses being manipulated for?
Well, I'm not sure how useful it is to try and distinguish in lab leak, lab manipulation. I mean, if we can prove manipulation, that would certainly prove it came from a lab. In terms of lab leak, I mean, you could have the leak either of a manipulated virus or of a natural virus that had been collected from the bat caves in Wuhan but had not been manipulated. In sort of practical terms, I guess it doesn't make a great deal of difference. It would still have been a terrible accident that has led to the death of 3 million people.
Okay, thank you. And can you just explain, Nicholas, why are these to a lot of us, we're like, what on earth are people doing? Why would you be manipulating viruses?
Well, the rationale has been that we've had many of these epidemics already where a natural virus leaps from animals to humans. So maybe we could get ahead of nature's game by taking these viruses into the lab and seeing what sort of 1 or 2 mutational steps are required in order to make them into pandemics, and that would allow us to predict and maybe prevent pandemics. And that is the rationale. I don't think it's a very persuasive one. It's been likened to looking for a gas leak with a lighted match.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're now beginning to realize that it's a highly dangerous and doubtful operation, given that complete lab safety is a mirage. We just shouldn't take these enormous risks, and we should find other ways to try and predict or assess these epidemics.
Nicholas, thank you. Ian, can I just go back to you, just because I wanted to put a different point to you, which is that the kind of the frustration here, or even anger, is misdirected, in that it's one thing to, if you like, blame the Lancet or Nature for either standing in the way of publication or choosing to publish one argument versus another, or even the scientific community in the West trying to stop the politicization of that blame game. But isn't the real issue here, doesn't the real issue here sit with the Chinese government, the Wuhan Institute for Virology itself, and potentially for the WHO for going along with it? Isn't that really where the focus should be?
Well, we don't, of course, know the answers to that. I mean, just picking up on what Karen said earlier, I came to this very skeptical because I'd heard Trump was involved, and I am very antipathetic to Trump. I don't like him. I don't like what he stands for. I don't like his lying. And so, but I began to look into the WHO, and I evolved to it through that. And the more I looked, the more questions were raised. I do think Trump definitely muddied the waters. Where should the blame lie? Of course, ultimately, we know that the Chinese dictatorship has behaved scandalously from the start of this pandemic. We know that they covered it up from the start. We know that they repressed debate on it. We know that they silenced doctors. We know that they lied about the genetic sequencing procedures they were carrying out. We know that there are so many things they did wrong. They could have stopped it a lot earlier. Had they done so, it's not impossible, it's unlikely, but it's not impossible that the pandemic wouldn't have been quite so severe. So very much the Chinese government deserves blame. We don't really know. We know that I feel slightly sorry almost for some of the scientists involved at WIV and at some of the other laboratories, because they're in an invidious position, because in mid-February, Xi Jinping took control of this and has threatened the death penalty or being prosecuted for espionage for any scientist talking out of line. Therefore, I think there are lots of really brilliant scientists and good journalists and people like that in China who would love to get the truth out there, and they're terrified. And I think I feel very sorry for those people involved because of this pressure they're under. So yes, ultimately the Chinese dictatorship is at fault. But my anger towards people like Peter Daszak going around saying that it's baloney and it's conspiracy theory, but to talk about even a laboratory leak, and the people like Dennis who have colluded with him in this, my anger towards them is because they've been effectively appeasing and working with the Chinese dictatorship to suppress proper discussion and proper investigation of the origins, and this really matters. And of course, we know that Peter Daszak has a vested interest in it because he was working with Xi Jinping. They'd found 500 new coronaviruses, they'd sampled 10,000 bats together, and he has a very vested interest in it not being a laboratory leak, and that should always be made clear. And so, that is where the blame should lie. But equally, that's why I think it's so wrong that some scientists have behaved in this way to shut down debate, because it's such an important issue, both scientifically but also geopolitically.
Dennis?
Well, again, the issue is where do we go from here? And it's fundamentally, we need the evidence, and we don't have the evidence one way or the other. I strongly disagree with the implications in Ian's comments. I don't find them helpful as much as sort of pointing a way to what can we do to make sure that we get the kind of investigative work done in China that, again, will move us from opinions to ones that are evidence-based. That's the critical issue.
But Dennis, can I just ask you a question, a practical one, right? Which is this, and I'm going to come to my colleague Kerry Thomas in a moment because he's been trying to figure out how we do this. But here, the issue is this: is that, of course, you know, we don't revere scientists, but we do hold you in a certain esteem, and especially when it's coming to things like this, because the truth is we don't understand the details. And so the difficulty, I don't know the backstory on Peter Daszak, but the difficulty is if you participate in a WHO investigation, that takes you to Wuhan, but not inside the Wuhan Institute for Virology, and makes it impossible for you to get the real evidence. You sort of think the job of the scientist in that process is to say, this thing, I'm having no part of this because actually there's no credible answer that it can deliver. And that's the job there. How should scientists behave when the investigation into this critical source is itself politicized?
Look, the investigation, if you want to call it that, the WHO exercise, I think is more appropriate term for it, that occurred earlier this year, did not move forward an investigative process. They didn't get access to primary data. They didn't get access to much of what you would have liked to have seen them get access. I think they would have been better served by pointing out the difference between the data that they had and the data that they didn't have, and what's the data we do need in order to draw conclusions. There were no conclusions, I think, that they could have drawn, no substantive evidence-based conclusions that they could draw from the work that was done earlier this year. I think the Director General Tedros has made it clear subsequently that he sees that investigation or that exercise was not sufficient, that it needs to be followed up with a robust investigation that allows full access to the kind of data related to the laboratory and related to all of the aspects of the markets and the animal trade, et cetera, so that you can get real evidence as to where this virus was circulating when, and use that to draw insights as to what its genesis was.
Dennis, thank you. I'm just asking my colleague Kerry Thomas, because the truth is, you know, a lot of the time we kind of toot our horn about being a slow newsroom and feel that this is an advantage to us. The reality is this is one of those stories where through the second half of last year, we started asking the question, how do we do the lab leak story? We had that conversation with Nick Petrovsky that I think Ian mentioned, you know, who'd written that piece in MIT, in the MIT review. And so you've been looking at this for a while. I just wonder where you've got to.
But I'm starting to wonder whether we've been slow enough, actually, you know, despite what you say, because I mean, the truth is, I think we're still wrestling with this difficulty. And I want to sort of, I know we generally don't ask questions on these thinkings, but I do want to sort of ask Dennis and Nick in particular, how we contend with the fact that we may never, is it possible we will never get to the answer about the origins of COVID? It's possible that the WHO investigation was perhaps the best opportunity we've had so far to get to the bottom of it. It's hard for me to imagine that the Chinese will grant access again in the way that in the end they had to for that one. But the reason I say have we been slow enough is if you look at it's because we haven't really moved beyond the circumstantial. That actually the evidence that's produced by people who propose the sort of lab leak theory is sometimes heavily circumstantial. So yes, the taking down of a data set at the Wuhan Institute in September 2019, not normal behavior, circumstantially looks hard to explain. You've had this US intelligence report about 3 people who may have been hospitalized in Wuhan, possibly connected with the WIV in November 2019. You've got these factors like we've already talked about on the call, the lack of this intermediate host. Is it surprising that we haven't found the civet cat version of SARS-CoV-2 that we found for SARS? Is it surprising that we haven't found that yet? And we're still getting evidence pouring on both sides. I was reading a paper today which from Cell magazine, which had found a number of other coronaviruses in bats, which again looked as if it could perhaps, suggested that there was perhaps an even bigger pool of coronaviruses out there that could have been candidates for this kind of spillover into humans. But again, that also circumstantial. I was reading another paper that was looking at the animals that were passing through the markets in Wuhan. That too, it says there weren't many pangolins, or perhaps no pangolins, for example, being traded through that market in the crucial period. But even they had to admit that they couldn't tell very much because the market had been closed for, has been closed since March 2020. So there are these huge constraints on our ability to really progress this investigation. And so, James, if I could, I'd like to ask Dennis whether it's possible that we will never know the answer to this question, or do you take it as read that in the end we are going to find out?
Well, first off, if we're going to find out, we need to be able to get in and do the investigation. And whether that happens or not, look, one of the great real tragedies about all of this discussion is how a tragic global health event has been so heavily politicized, which means that political leaders are able to dominate and drive the narrative at the expense of being able to really get to the kinds of answers that you're asking for. And it's China has not done anyone service by not allowing the kind of investigative work that needs to go on. But it's also understandable on some level when you see just the behavior of President Trump and how he turned a public health event into a political event. So no excuses and no justifications. Be able to move beyond all of this. It's going to have to ultimately be that there's a sense of trust that allows this type of investigation to go forward. And we are more distrustful today than we were even a year ago. So I don't know until we build some measure of trust whether we'll ever get to that definitive answer. But let me also say that, after a year and a half that we haven't found the virus in an animal per se, Ebola, which we've been struggling with for 50 years, we're still trying to get to the primary reservoir for that. The investigation and identification of hosts and secondary hosts and intermediary hosts is not something that necessarily happens very rapidly. It was quite remarkable how expeditiously the research associated with the original SARS epidemic in 2003 played itself out. So not a definitive answer at this point as to animal with this virus is not unusual when it comes to natural virology. And we're still stymied on any number of deadly viruses, again, Ebola, when we're still trying to track that down. And this is 50 years of investigative work that is still struggling to come up with that definitive answer.
Nick, do you want to weigh in? I'm just going to follow up with a question that's asked, but Nick, do you want to answer Kerry's question about it's possible just we don't ever know?
Yeah, I'd like to say two things. Firstly, I think we're looking at a massive institutional failure, a failure of journalism as an institution, a failure of the scientific community, a failure of science journals, and a failure of virologists. I think it is absolutely ridiculous for scientists to try and hide behind President Trump's skirts and say, Trump made me do it, as we heard Dr. Carroll say just now. that is not the issue. The issue is that scientists fail to get on top of this issue. They failed to lead the public in the right direction. They sat on their fannies for a year because it was more convenient for them to do so, and for whatever other reasons. Secondly, as to whether we're ever going to know the truth about this. Firstly, although, as I've said before, we have no direct evidence on either side, I think we shouldn't diss circumstantial evidence too much. Most of our court cases are decided on circumstantial evidence. So I think you can build a sufficient amount of circumstantial evidence that most people at some point are going to say, if indeed this is the case, that this virus escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So at that point, the Chinese are going to have to decide whether they want to be a pariah for the foreseeable future, or whether they're going to cooperate with the rest of the world in ensuring something like this doesn't happen again. So although it's not at this moment likely that the Chinese are going to cooperate, I think that they may decide in the future that it is in their interests to do so. And even if they don't, this small band of dissident scientists that has made such progress in the last year and a half, they've done better than any intelligence agency, they've done better than any scientific body, they've done better than the National Academy of Sciences or the National Institutes of Health. They have shamed everyone else, and they've done so well in plucking out obscure Chinese doctoral theses, lots of evidence that does bear on the origin of this virus, that it's quite possible they may come up with something that it may be sort of clinching evidence or maybe close to it. So I wouldn't despair of us finding out the truth of this one way or the other.
Nick, thank you. I'm just going to speak to one point that Karen Key makes in the chat about this being sort of kind of conspiratorial in tone. For what it's worth, I always think that it's worth listening to the tone, and this particular tone at times like this, because this anger is, I think, born of the fact that people are deeply, have obviously been traumatized for a whole host of reasons by this pandemic, and are deeply frustrated by the fact that they don't understand where it's come from, and have grown increasingly suspicious that the reasons that were given to them for where it came from were untrue. So I think, although it's easy to sort of dismiss it as conspiratorial, actually, I think that the tone of this is actually quite important to listen to. I just want to pick up, I want to, if I can, come to Poppy Seabag Montefiore in a moment, just about China and Chinese culture on this. But I want to just go to my colleague, Matt D'Ancona, for a moment, because I want to ask the opposite question to Kerry's question, which is not, is it possible we never find out, right? But what happens if we do? What happens if in the end, the evidence ends up coming out against the lab leak theory, and in the end you've got people around the world pointing at China for covering up an institutional failure that caused so much death?
Well, it's a nightmare. It reminds me of when there was the whole sort of ghastly anticlimax of WMD not being found in Iraq. And I asked someone who'd been involved in this country in the whole sort of process of the JIC and weapons inspection, what about the theory that the WMD had in fact been moved out of Iraq and into Syria, which was a theory that was doing the rounds. And this person said, Christ, I hope not, because that would have provided another layer of problems, and though it had been definitive, it would have turned what was a fiasco and a disaster in many ways into a completely different form of problem. And of course, to your point, James, the idea that China has somehow been a not just evasive, but actually the prospect that it might turn out to have been a bad faith actor, malicious, it would have geopolitical consequences that are unfathomable. And the relationship between Biden's America and China, as we saw at the G7 and elsewhere in NATO, are already very tense and complicated by the fact that they're competing on any number of levels, but also they do $2 billion worth of trade with one another a day. So this is not a straightforward issue. Heaven alone knows how the West, for want of a better word, would deal with a China that was strong, but had been proven to be acting maliciously and positively deviously in this instance. That it would also blow to pieces the remaining credibility of the WHO, and it would leave us with a really nasty long tail about biosecurity, which would be that biosecurity would become obsessive compulsive. Preparing oneself against whatever the next pandemic is or might be would not just be a business of a question of getting the right PPE, getting the right retrovirals, getting the right ventilators, vaccines, and so on prepared. It would mean a kind of obsession with the world's biofacilities that we're already close to having, but we would then become on a par with anything we saw in the Cold War about nuclear facilities. And you then move to a situation where drones would be flying routinely over biofacilities, and it would ramp up the tempo to a situation we haven't seen since the Cold War. So I
get the point. Yeah. So
for the good of the world, I actually, although I want an answer to this as a journalist, as a citizen of the planet, I really hope that doesn't turn out to be the answer.
I think the reason I wanted to ask you the question is it strikes me there's a really significant group of people, many people who've got a strong interest in not ever finding an answer.
Yes,
exactly those reasons. The reason I wanted to come to Poppy is that Poppy and I both worked in China in different times in our lives, and when I was listening to Ian talking about China sitting on the details of this or holding back certain data sets, the thing that struck me, Poppy, was Chinese institutions are meticulous note takers, right? Even by comparison with kind of, sort of British bureaucracies, China famously takes notes. And I know that's a huge generalization, but it's rooted in something true, isn't it? When you were listening to Ian and Dennis talking about how you're going to actually get to the evidence, where do you think in this case the evidence most likely sits?
Such a good question, because I've been speaking to scientists over the last few days about this, and you can have a lab leak without even knowing you've had one. So that is also a likely thing that one of if this lab leak hypothesis is true, that one of these labs it might have happened without them even noticing. So I mean, and I saw that in the WHO report, in the annexes, there is a kind of all the information that the Wuhan Institute of Virology has submitted to the WHO, and they've submitted all their case against the September, why they took the data down. They've said that they've tested all the people in their lab and that everyone was antibody negative. So there is all this work that they've done to try and disprove all these claims that have been made against them. But who knows?
Mm-hmm.
If that's true or whether it's from another lab, or So I mean, there is, and I think that a lot of they might be taking notes. They might be taking notes, but are they taking the right notes? Like there are so many things that happened in the early days of the virus that just errors, and not intentional errors. They were following systems, but the system wasn't working. They were supposed to have a kind of alert hospital, a sentinel hospital as part after SARS, in every place. They didn't have one of those hospitals in Wuhan. It was somewhere else in the province. So in Wuhan, where you have these virology labs, you didn't have a sentinel hospital that would alert the WHO or alert Beijing or alert the CDC. So there's just so many
areas. Poppy, thank you. I'm alive to the time. I want to go, given Ian that you weighed in on this quite forcefully, but also that you weighed in on this in June. I want to go to you and just ask where you think the world should look next. I mean, at least our world, the world of journalism, should look next.
I think the world of journalism just needs to carry on trying to report on what it can find the evidence. You make a very good point about the bureaucracy. Some of the stuff that has come out is because good notes were kept and evidence is out there, and some of it's been still posted up there. Right. There was an intriguing story which I was shown and passed the details and wrote about a few weeks ago, which showed that actually the first cases go back to mid-November. And that evidence came from the notes being taken by the professor who was tasked by the Chinese state with collating all the information on the early deaths. And he'd actually posted it in public and inadvertently given away even the name and address of a couple of the early patients in mid-November. So I think that's very true. I think what we need to do is just approach this like any other story, with a degree of skepticism at any official sources, but looking for the evidence. And that, I think, the failing that there's been both scientifically and journalistically has been not to follow the evidence, partly because Trump did muddy the waters, partly because scientists muddied the waters. But I think what journalists should do is keep pressing away. And I actually disagree slightly with Matt, really, who I often agree with. I think in a way it's almost better if it does turn out to be a lab leak, because that's sort of human error, assuming it is human error. And that's sort of more understandable, in a way less scary than if it turns out to be due to our interaction with animals, like some of the previous epidemics we've seen. In a way, that's almost more terrifying, as we live in a world of growing population and growing challenge for space with wildlife. I think it's almost better if it turns out to be a human error, even if it does lead to a rather cataclysmic debate, shall we say, with the Chinese authorities. But it could even turn out good if it leads to the end of the ultra-nationalist Xi Jinping and a more rational regime in China, which is not 100% impossible. I like to be optimistic.
Well, listen, I appreciate that optimism at the end. Nicholas Wade and Dennis Carroll, I want to give you the last words. Where do you think, and how do you think we should look next to find out where this all began?
Well, I think I don't have much to add to what Ian Birrell said. We should just keep reporting.
Well, thank you. I think we'll definitely do that. Dennis?
Well, again, I think we need to sort of lower the temperature on this whole discussion, this whole debate. And we need to build a reasonable relationship with the Chinese scientific community to allow the kind of investigation that will shine a light on its origins. Temperature is way too high. We're not going to get a way forward till we lower the temperature. And I have to say that I'm disappointed in hearing, conspiratorial theories talked about so easily in this discussion. We've always said, look, I'm a big believer that labs have an enormous vulnerability, particularly when they're dealing with high consequence pathogens. But I'm also a believer that, unlike what was just said, we have a responsibility for how we manage our interactions with the earth around us, with the ecosystems. We're not victims here when a virus jumps from wildlife into us. They're a direct consequence of what we've been doing on this planet. So I think we need to be much more accountable across the board with respect to laboratories and with respect to the role we play in destabilizing the ecosystems, allowing for these events to occur in the first place.
Dennis, thank you. And Nicholas, thank you. And in fact, thank you, everyone. I know that in some ways, Dennis, I agree with you and understand about this, about sort of lowering the temperature, having the conversation. I think one of the reasons the temperature is high is that the curious thing is we spent so much time trying to figure out things like lockdowns and vaccines. Actually, having the occasion like this to trade obviously very different points of view without all the evidence that's available so far, but with a sense that we haven't been given the information we need or some of the information that really is available, I think does stoke strong feelings. And it's no bad thing actually to sort of to air them. I come away journalistically, and I suppose I'm talking to Kerry here because Kerry and I are trying to put our heads together on how we research this. I do think there's something really interesting in just following the logic of the fact that, that China is an extraordinarily meticulous note taker. Now, the question is, where does information leak? Because I still think that the most logical source of the largest amount of information is going to sit not just in the Wuhan Institute for Virology, but within government departments that oversee it. I think there are some real questions there, obviously, around understanding the disquiet that must exist within and around the WHO, because being party, as you described, Dennis, to what was not an investigation but an exercise, right, is really problematic for everyone involved. I think that Nick's point about the way in which information reached the Lancet, reached Nature, what was admitted and what wasn't, I think that story is going to run, and it feels to me as though the way in which public debate among scientists is conducted matters. I take the point that, you know, that Ian and Karen were both making around journalism. One is around not having too much of the benefit of hindsight, but understanding the context of the times. On the other hand, the extent to which journalism falls in line behind, if you like, scientific consensus and establishment, and there is a need for that kind of dogged reporting and sort of instinctive skepticism. We haven't talked, as we said, we haven't talked about the relationships amongst scientists and the way in which those work. We touched on them slightly, but not between the EU, the US, and China. And there are two sides to that, obviously. The question about kind of, you know, people touched on vested interests, but we all do have an interest in that cooperation too. So I think there's an element of that we need to understand. My final point, which is kind of curious, is in none of this have we talked about intelligence and the intelligence agencies. So I know Matt touched on at the end a kind of world in which there was, if you like, oversight and intelligence into the world of biosecurity. But you would have thought that by now there would be a real interest in coming up with something that passes for intelligence on the source of this. I come away from this thinking we're going to end up in a place that is unsatisfactory, but better than where we're at, which is not a categoric identification of where the COVID-19 virus began, but with a body of evidence that leans overwhelmingly one way or another. And I hope that our part can be in bringing conversations like this together and driving forward then some reporting and journalism that helps us better understand it. That's a long way through a long summary of a long conversation, but I hope it makes some sense of it. It was a fascinating conversation. I just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you to Nicholas Wade and Dennis Carroll for making the time to join us. Thank you also everyone for sharing different pieces in the chat. Please keep reading them, and in one form or other, we're going to come back to this conversation. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day or your evening.